Hey there, welcome to True Nightmares. Tonight, you're getting calm, creepy, true stories to keep you company while you fall asleep. If you enjoy this kind of dark, sleepy atmosphere, please like the video and subscribe so you always have something eerie to drift off to. I grew up moving from one place to another because both of my parents were in the military. We never stayed in one city for too long, and that constant change became a normal part of my life. When I got older, I went to college in Maryland and Washington, D.C., and eventually I settled between Maryland and Colorado for most of my adult years. Maryland always ended up pulling me back. Somehow, it felt like a place caught between memories and routine. This past summer, I decided to take a break from work. For the first time in years, my mornings belonged to me. I started walking my dogs early each day, around the same time I used to wake up for my job, 5 o'clock sharp. Summers in Maryland can get brutally hot and humid, so early mornings were the only time the air felt fresh. I would throw on a pair of sneakers, clip on the leashes, and step into the quiet before sunrise, when the world still felt half asleep. About 2 months into summer, around early or mid-July, I heard for the first time about my supposed doppelganger. At first, I brushed it off as a minor misunderstanding, something that would make a funny story. But it didn't stay that simple. My dogs and I had a little routine. Once a week, we would stop by the local bank downtown because they gave out dog treats. The staff there knew my dogs' names and liked to chat about harmless topics, the weather, local events, or weekend plans. I got used to seeing their friendly faces. But one week I got sick, and for about 10 days, I stopped walking my dogs altogether. When I finally felt better and resumed our routine, I stopped by the bank again, leash in hand, my dogs wagging their tails like we hadn't missed a beat. As soon as I walked through the door, the branch manager smiled at me, though his expression carried something strange relief, maybe. He said how glad he was to see me and that he had worried I was upset with him. The comment caught me off guard. I asked what he meant, and his face changed from relief to confusion. He explained that just a week ago, he had seen me at a town event where he was volunteering. According to him, I had walked up to his stand to get ice cream, but when he greeted me warmly, I'd acted like I didn't know him and left abruptly. He told me it had bothered him since, and he was worried he'd done something to offend me. I laughed in disbelief and told him that it wasn't me, honestly. I hadn't been to that event in 2 years, but he didn't seem convinced. He kept insisting that it was definitely me, down to the tattoos on my legs. He even said that I must have been embarrassed because maybe my boyfriend was jealous. The entire exchange left me unsettled. I tried to assure him again that I hadn't been there, that I'd been sick, and that he must have mistaken someone else for me. Still, he shook his head as if I was lying. Eventually, I dropped it, figuring it was one of those bizarre coincidences you can't explain. About a week later, another strange encounter happened. I met a friend for coffee downtown, and afterward, I decided to stop by one of my favorite local stores. The store's owner and manager both knew me pretty well since I visited often. When I walked in that morning, the owner looked surprised to see me. She smiled and said, "Oh, back so soon?" I laughed, assuming she was joking, and apologized for not stopping by in a while. But then her expression changed slightly, and she said, "Wait, didn't you just leave? You were here not even half an hour ago." I frowned and told her that I hadn't been there that day at all. She stared at me for a moment, her eyes scanning my clothes. Then she asked if I had gone home to change before coming back, and that's when I realized she genuinely believed what she was saying. I told her again that I hadn't been in her store and that I'd been having coffee nearby with a mutual friend. The color drained from her face as she swore she'd seen me just minutes earlier. She said the woman had the same build, same hairstyle, and even the same tattoos. She mentioned that the woman had bought clothes in my usual size and style, using cash, which threw her off because, in all the years she'd known me, I'd never paid in cash. There was no video footage, no receipt to prove anything, but her certainty left me unsettled. At that point, I began to reason with myself. Years earlier, when I moved to Colorado, there had been another girl named Ashley who arrived in Frederick around the same time. Maybe she looked like me. Maybe the coincidences had just built up over time. Still, that explanation didn't satisfy me completely. It felt too easy, too rational for how specific these encounters were. A few weeks later, something happened that truly made me question everything. I was walking my dogs one morning with my boyfriend's daughter, who is 23. The morning was quiet, the sun low on the horizon, and the walk felt peaceful until we saw an older couple approaching from the other side of the street. As they got closer, the man stared at me with a puzzled expression, like he was trying to remember where he'd seen me before. When we were about to cross paths, his face suddenly lit up with recognition. He crouched down, smiled, and called my dog by her name. "Hello, Charlie," he said warmly. Now, here's where it gets strange. Charlie, my Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, is the most friendly creature on earth. She loves people and runs up to anyone who looks her way. But that morning, she froze, tail down, and stepped back behind my leg. It was completely out of character for her. My boyfriend's daughter noticed it too, giving me a questioning look. The man laughed softly and said, "Oh, sorry. Charlotte, don't you like being called Charlie anymore?" My heart skipped a beat. Charlotte is Charlie's full name, and that name isn't printed anywhere. Her tag only says Charlie. Hardly anyone knows that Charlie is short for Charlotte. I could count on one hand the number of people who knew the full story behind her name. I named her after a character in a show because the woman and I shared something deeply personal. We both couldn't have children. It was a small, private connection that wasn't meant for strangers. I asked the man politely if we knew each other, apologizing for not remembering him, and he immediately seemed embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Aren't you, Ashley?" When I told him I was, he relaxed a little but kept talking. "You and your dog, Charlotte, you told me about how you chose her name because of that show with the woman who couldn't have kids. That really stayed with me." My breath caught. He couldn't have possibly known that. My boyfriend's daughter looked at me in shock, probably because she knew exactly how private that story was. The man went on to explain that we'd met at the same town event the banker had mentioned, the one I hadn't attended in years. He said it was when I lived near the Maryland School for the Deaf, across from the old Victorian houses. He even remembered the year, 2017. That was the moment everything inside me froze. In 2017, I wasn't even living in Maryland. I was in Colorado. I hadn't returned to the East Coast until 2020. And, most impossibly, Charlie hadn't even been born in 2017. The man looked confused when I told him that. He glanced down at Flynn, my other dog, and asked if he was new. He had never seen him before, he said. It was as if his memories were overlapping two different realities, where both versions of me existed, but one was years ahead of the other. As we stood there, each detail that came out of his mouth dug deeper into my certainty that something uncanny was happening. He wasn't lying, at least. His face didn't suggest that. He sincerely believed he had met me before, spoken to me, and remembered personal things only I could have shared. When I explained the timeline to him, that I had lived in Colorado and that neither of the details made sense, he stared at me as though he'd seen a ghost. He finally apologized, calling it the strangest coincidence he'd ever experienced. Then he laughed uneasily and said the thing people always do in such moments. "Well, I guess you've got a doppelganger out there with your name and everything." That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the events in my mind. The banker, the store owner, the older man, they couldn't all be making it up. 3 separate people, each describing someone with my name, my face, my tattoos, and even the same personal details. The logical part of my mind wanted to believe it was a case of mistaken identity. Maybe someone in my town just looked eerily similar to me. But what about the name Charlie? The tattoos? The way their encounters lined up perfectly with events I had missed by coincidence? It was all too specific. The more I thought about it, the more I entertained a strange possibility, one that probably sounds delusional unless you've lived through something you can't explain. What if this other me wasn't just a look-alike? What if she was me, but from another timeline? What if, in some other version of reality, I had stayed in Maryland instead of moving to Colorado back in 2013? Maybe that version of me built her life here, without gaps or resets, and now, somehow, our paths had begun to overlap. Like 2 mirrors reflecting the same person at slightly different angles. I know how that sounds impossible. But after this summer, I'm not sure what I believe anymore. I've tried to reason through every possibility. A twin I never knew existed, an elaborate prank, even someone stalking me well enough to mimic details of my life. Nothing feels satisfying. Every theory leaves holes that logic can't fill. Now, sometimes, When I walk my dogs early in the morning and pass by familiar streets, I feel a faint pull to look around as though she might be near. I wonder what I'd do if I actually saw her, a woman who looks exactly like me, walking the same path, living a version of the life I might have had. Would I talk to her? Would it be dangerous too? Would the moment tear something apart or fix it? I've come to think about the idea of parallel timelines more than I ever imagined I would. Maybe she's not a ghost or a coincidence at all. Maybe she's living the version of my life where I made a different choice years ago, and somehow she slipped into my world just long enough to remind me that possibility exists. Still, sometimes late at night, I think about that man calling Charlie by her name and seeing her recoil in fear. If that other version of me exists, maybe she's seen me too and felt the same cold wave of confusion. Maybe, somewhere out there, she's wondering if she should look for me. Growing up, I never really had a chance to stay in one place for long. We were a family constantly on the move, always chasing the next opportunity or the next paycheck. Moving boxes became a permanent part of our home. They were never fully unpacked, just moved from house to house, collecting dust and stickers from different cities. My dad was a good man, but he had a complicated relationship with authority. He was smart and hardworking, but his temper and pride often got in the way. Whenever he disagreed with a boss or couldn't stand company rules, he'd quit or get fired, and that meant it was time for us to move again. In 2003, we found ourselves relocating once more. I was about 8 years old then. My dad had landed another job somewhere in a small, not-so-great part of town. He came home one evening looking proud, saying he'd found a great deal. It was a small, old house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, with a detached garage that looked like it could collapse if you leaned too hard on it. The rent was just $300 a month, which even back then was unbelievably cheap. My dad couldn't believe his luck. When he went to sign the lease, the landlord mentioned something odd. He said, "I'm required by law to tell you that someone passed away in the house within the last 5 years." He didn't give any details, just said it like it was routine. My dad didn't care much about superstitions or ghost stories, so he shrugged it off and signed the papers. The next week, we packed our half-unopened boxes, loaded the truck, and moved in. At first, the house seemed normal. It smelled a little musty, like old wood and rain-soaked carpet, but nothing too strange. The rooms were small, ceilings slightly uneven, paint chipping on the walls. But by the second day, things started getting weird. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small sounds at first. A door creaking open somewhere we hadn't touched, kitchen drawers rattling on their own, faint footsteps when no one was walking. My dad would joke that it was the pipes settling or that our ears were playing tricks on us, but deep down, I could tell he was uneasy. The noises weren't constant, but they were frequent enough to notice. It almost felt like we weren't alone in that house, like someone else was living quietly beside us, going about their daily routine, opening cabinets, turning water on and off, walking down the hallway late at night. Nothing violent or directly threatening ever happened in those early days, so we got used to it. We told ourselves it was just an old house making old house noises. One thing that always stood out was the front door. It was strange, it had a keyhole on both sides. You couldn't leave the house or come back in without the key, so if the keys went missing, you were stuck. And, as you might have guessed, about a week after we moved in, that's exactly what happened. There were still boxes everywhere, and the house was in total disarray. My dad was already frustrated and tired from work, so when he couldn't find the keys one morning, he completely lost it. He tore through piles of boxes, lifting cushions, yelling, accusing me of hiding them as some kind of joke. I remember sitting in the corner, scared to say anything. Then out of nowhere, we both heard the sound of something metallic hitting the floor. The keys had landed in plain sight, right in front of the living room couch. They hadn't just fallen off a surface. They'd appeared out of thin air, dropped straight down like someone invisible had tossed them there. My dad froze. He stared at them for a long moment, then picked them up slowly like he didn't quite believe what he'd just seen. He muttered something under his breath, shoved the keys in his pocket, and left for work. Neither of us talked about it that day. Over the next few months, the keys became the center of the house's strange activity. Every night after work, my dad would place them in a glass bowl on top of the old tube television. Every morning, they would be gone. Sometimes we'd find them later in random places on the dining table, under the couch, even outside once. But the creepiest time was when we found them inside a sealed box of pots and pans we hadn't unpacked yet. The box was taped shut, with only 2 small handle holes on the sides. Somehow, the keys had been pushed through one of those tiny openings, like whoever or whatever was doing this wanted us to notice. My dad laughed it off, trying to hide how nervous he was, but even I could see that none of it made sense. For a while, life in that house carried on like that, inconvenient, creepy, but not outright terrifying. That changed about 8 months later. By then, I'd started to think the house had a personality of its own. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't evil either, more like something that just wanted attention. And then came the nights of the stomping. Almost every night, between 2 and 3 a.m., loud footsteps would echo down the hallway outside our bedrooms. Not the light footsteps of a person just walking. These were heavy, deliberate stomps, like a grown man pacing angrily. The sound would start at one end of the hall, stop for a few seconds, and then start again, getting louder each time. I'd lie there, wide awake, staring at my door and waiting for it to stop. One night, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't take it anymore, the sleeplessness, the fear, the weird noises. I was 8, angry, exhausted, and scared. I shouted out into the darkness, "Stop stomping around. I need sleep, damn it." The sound stopped instantly, and for about 15 seconds, the house went dead silent. I almost felt proud, like I'd finally scared it away. But then, from the hallway, came a thunderous sound, like something huge charging straight toward my room. The next second, there were 3 violent knocks on my door, so loud they shook the walls. I screamed. My dad woke up instantly and called out, asking if I was okay. My stomach twisted into knots. I suddenly felt sick to my stomach and ran down the hallway to the bathroom as fast as I could. My body felt completely out of control, shaking and trembling. I didn't even make it all the way. I was so terrified that I made a mess halfway there. My dad followed to check on me, his face pale and confused. Between tears and embarrassment, I told him what had happened. He didn't laugh or try to dismiss it. Instead, he sat next to me and said softly, "If you ever feel scared again, you can come sleep in my room. Nothing can touch you when I'm here." From that night on, I started keeping my bedroom door open, just in case. The final straw came about a week later. My dad had been seeing a woman for over a year, and by then, she was staying with us most nights. She was kind to me and tried her best to make the place feel warm and normal despite everything going on. But one night, they got into a small argument before bed, something trivial, like chores or cleaning. It wasn't a big fight, just quiet tension between them. They went to sleep eventually. Around that same time, again 2:30 a.m., something horrific happened. According to her, she woke up on the floor, half inside the bedroom, half in the hallway. She felt pressure around her ankle and realized in panic that something was dragging her out of bed. At first, she thought it was a nightmare, but when she fully woke up, she was already being pulled down the hallway. She screamed, and whatever was holding her leg instantly let go. She scrambled back into the room, turned on all the lights, and told my dad everything in a shaking voice. He believed her. Without hesitation, he sent me to stay with my aunt the next day. He stayed in the house by himself while searching for another place to live. I think he didn't want to admit that the house scared him, but I know it did. Even after sending me away, he told me on the phone that small things kept happening. Items moving, lights flickering, weird shadows in corners. During the weeks he spent packing up, some of his friends came by to keep him company. Strangely, every single person who visited mentioned something odd. Each one claimed they saw a small white dog walking around the house when they came in. The weird part? We never owned a dog. My dad didn't know what to say to them. By that point, he just wanted to get out and never look back. Within a month, we'd moved again. Even years later, that house sticks in my memory. Sometimes I wonder who lives there now, whether they ever hear the same pounding footsteps at night, or if the ghost, or whatever it was, finally found peace after we left. Part of me hopes it's quiet now. Another part of me kind of doubts it. There's one more story from that place that always makes my skin crawl when I think about it. My dad's girlfriend had brought a big yoga ball to the house, and as a restless 8-year-old, I loved playing with it. One afternoon, she told me I could roll it down the hallway with her as long as I was careful. We stood at opposite ends of the hall, tossing the ball lightly back and forth. For a few minutes, it was fun. Then, out of nowhere, something impossible happened. I threw the ball toward her, and right before it reached her, it stopped midair, just froze in place and then rolled backward toward me. I remember laughing at first because my childlike brain couldn't process what I was seeing. But when I looked up, she wasn't laughing. She looked horrified. She just said quickly that she didn't want to play anymore and walked me into the living room. At the time, I didn't understand why she suddenly seemed pale and shaky. Years later, when I thought back to it, that moment gave me chills. The way the ball moved like something unseen swatted it back was too deliberate to be coincidence. It's been decades since then, but that experience never really left me. I've lived in plenty of houses since, and none have ever felt quite like that one. There was always something there, not necessarily angry, but restless, maybe confused. It felt trapped, still trying to live out slices of a life that was long over. And in a strange way, I sometimes think it wasn't trying to hurt us. Maybe it was just trying to be heard. Every once in a while, when I think about those nights, I can almost hear those heavy footsteps again, slow, measured, pacing down the hallway like someone still waiting for something that never came. When I was 10 years old, my grandmother moved in with us. It was about 6 months after my grandfather passed away, and though I didn't really understand it back then, I think she was just lonely. That big, quiet house she'd lived in for decades must have felt empty without him, too many memories, and not enough life left in the walls. My parents decided to bring her into our home. My mom had a few reservations about it, but Dad insisted it was the right thing to do. I didn't object. In fact, I was thrilled. Grandma was loud and funny and full of stories. I loved her. She always smelled like lavender and peppermint, and she always had boiled sweets tucked somewhere in her pocket. Whenever she saw me, she'd wink and slip me a couple like it was our little secret. Anytime I got in trouble, she was the first one to speak up for me. I adored her for that. She made me feel special, seen. But my favorite thing about Grandma wasn't the sweets or her laugh or even how she defended me when I messed up. What I loved most were her stories. She could tell a story like no one else. Some were about her childhood, about growing up during the war, about rations and air raids, about her and her friends sneaking around the southern coast after being evacuated. Some were funny, some sad, but the best ones, the ones I still think about, were the scary stories. Grandma had plenty of those. She told me that when she was a teenager, she dabbled a bit in mystical things, Ouija boards, tarot cards, seances. She said she was always curious about the other side, fascinated by what people couldn't quite see. Most of her ghost stories were harmless fun, the type that made you laugh nervously before bed and then forget about them the next morning. But there were a few that clung to me, a few that sank their claws into my imagination and never quite let go. She had a way of telling them that made every word feel more real than it should have been. She'd turn off the lights in my bedroom until the only glow came from the moon outside. Then she'd shuffle close, so close I could see every crease in her face and smell the sweet shop sugar on her breath. Her pale blue eyes would narrow in focus, as if she were pulling the story up from some deep, secret place inside. I remember losing sleep after some of those tales, hiding under my covers long after she'd kissed me goodnight. But out of all the stories Grandma ever told, there's one I'll never forget. The one that stuck with me all these years, the story of Mr. Long Fingers. It started the night I asked Grandma why she always preferred baths to showers. She spent ages in the bathtub, humming softly to herself, surrounded by candles and steam. It drove my mom crazy, but Grandma insisted it was the only time she could truly relax. That night, sitting on the edge of my bed, she smiled faintly and said, "It's because baths are safe for people like me. I wouldn't dare spend too long in a shower. It's far too risky." I frowned. Risky? Why? She looked at me seriously then. Well, people like me, people who are more sensitive, we have to be careful about certain things. Then, her voice dropped lower, softer. It's only risky if you close your eyes for too long. Something about the way she said it made a chill run down my back. What do you mean? I asked. Grandma turned her head slightly toward the window, letting a small pause build the tension. Then she said, Do you ever play that playground game where someone turns their back and everyone creeps up while they're not looking? I nodded. She gave a slow nod back. That's what it's like when you're in the shower with your eyes closed. Only, instead of your friends sneaking up on you, it's Mr. Longfingers. I remember shivering, though not from the cold. "Who's Mr. Longfingers?" I whispered. Grandma drew in a breath and leaned closer. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "No one knows for sure," she said. "Some say he's a creature drawn by the warmth and the scent of a person in the shower. Others think he's something darker, a spirit that slips through the steam, like a doorway between this world and the next. Nobody really knows. And the ones who've seen him," she paused. "Let's just say they can't talk about it anymore." I swallowed hard. "Why not?" "Don't worry about that, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing my hand. "You'll be fine, as long as you remember the rules." "What rules?" "When you're in the shower, don't keep your eyes closed for too long," she said. 5 seconds is fine. 10 is pushing it. But any longer than that, my voice trembled. "Then what happens?" She leaned so close I could feel her breath on my cheek. "That's when you might start to sense him. You'll get the feeling you're not alone anymore. Someone watching, waiting. And if you go longer than 15 seconds, that's when you'll hear it." "Hear what?" "The tap, tap, tap of his fingers on the glass," she said, her tone barely above a whisper now. "And if that ever happens, if you ever hear him, promise me you'll never open your eyes." I promised. Of course I did. And that night, I barely slept a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a pale face pressed against my bedroom window, long fingers twitching against the glass. When I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed of eyes floating in the dark, of fingers creeping toward my skin. It didn't get better in the mornings either. Every shower felt like a test. I'd never thought much about closing my eyes before, but suddenly it was impossible not to think about it. Water would pour down my face as I worked the shampoo into my hair, and Grandma's words would echo through my head. 5 seconds is fine. 10 is pushing it. By the time I counted past 10, my heart would start to pound. The air behind my eyelids went from red to black, and the sound of the water roaring in my ears made me feel trapped in a bubble. I would rush to rinse my hair, fingers moving quickly, the way kids speed up walking through a dark hallway just to get it over with. Sometimes I'd open my eyes too early, shampoo still stinging them, just to make sure I was alone. And every time, I'd peer through the fogged glass, half expecting to see a shape waiting there. Mom noticed the change in me first. She caught me crying out in my sleep one night and came to calm me down. When I told her about Grandma's story, about Mr. Longfingers, she didn't look angry at me. She looked furious at Grandma. That night, I pressed my ear to the wall between our rooms and listened to my parents argue. She told him there's a monster waiting to get him in the shower, Mom hissed. "A monster, Simon. The poor kid won't even close his eyes anymore. You need to talk to her first thing in the morning, or I will." The next night, Grandma came to my room again. She didn't bring sweets or stories. She just sat at the foot of my bed, her face pale in the moonlight. "You know I'd never let anything bad happen to you, don't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Good," she said, her blue eyes softening. "You're my brave boy. I only ever wanted to help you, to protect you. But maybe," she sighed, "maybe I went a little too far this time." She looked out the window for a long time before turning back to me with a faint smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll make sure Mr. Longfingers stays far away from you. If he dares to come near, he'll have to deal with me first." She patted my leg and whispered, "Sleep tight, my love." I fell asleep, imagining Grandma scaring away monsters, wrapped in the safety of her words. I didn't know it would be the last time I ever saw her alive. A week later, I woke up to the sound of water running. The steady rush of the shower echoed down the hallway. I sat up, heart already pounding. Something about it didn't feel right. I climbed out of bed and ran for the bathroom. The air felt cold and heavy as I knocked on the door. "Grandma?" I called. No answer. I knocked again, harder, still nothing. From behind me, I could hear my parents stirring, sleepy voices calling my name. But something in me couldn't wait. I reached for the handle, and it turned. A wave of hot, thick steam rolled out as the door opened. I coughed and squinted into the fog, stepping closer. The air smelled sharp like soap and heat and faintly metallic. Then I saw her. Grandma lay on the tiled floor of the shower, the water pouring over her still body. Her blue eyes were wide open, staring up in shock. One hand clutched against her chest, the other stretched toward the glass, streaks carved through the condensation finger marks, long and uneven. After that, everything became a blur of shouting and footsteps, and the paramedics rushing in. I don't remember crying. I just remember standing there, staring at those streaks on the glass. They said it was a heart attack, that it happened quickly, that she didn't suffer. But even at 10 years old, I knew that wasn't the truth. Not the whole truth, anyway. Because later, when everyone was gone and the house was quiet again, I snuck back to the bathroom. The steam had started to fade, the tiles cooling. But the glass still bore the marks of her fingers. I wiped a small section clean with my sleeve and leaned close. The streaks weren't random. They formed a pattern deliberate, dragging down in uneven taps. Just like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. Years have passed since then. I'm grown now, with a house of my own, a wife, and 2 kids. They think I'm odd because I refuse to use the shower. They tease me for insisting on baths, for making sure the kids do the same. My wife assumes it's because of the trauma that seeing my grandmother's body scarred me for life. She's half right, but there's something I've never told her. Something I try not to think about when I'm alone in the bathroom and the mirror fogs up. That night, after Grandma was taken away, I'd looked again at the marks on the glass. Beneath the set of 5 long smears, her fingertips there were others, longer, thinner, pressed from the opposite side of the glass. It's all starting to come back to me now, slowly, bit by bit, like fog lifting from an old photograph. I'm not sure what triggered it. Maybe it was opening up about my grandma's bedtime stories, or maybe it's the counseling sessions my wife finally convinced me to try. Whatever the reason, my childhood memories have started to creep back in. Memories of Grandma. Memories of the bedtime tales she used to whisper just before turning out the light. I always knew there were more stories, ones I'd forgotten or buried somewhere deep. But my mind before I turned 13 was like a dark landscape, just small patches of light surrounded by a great, endless shadow. Lately those shadows seemed to be thinning, revealing moments I didn't even know were still there. And the strange thing is, I'm not sure I want to see what's been hiding behind them. I must have been about 7 years old when Grandma told me about the special knock. It was late past my bedtime, and I remember lying under the covers, tucked tightly into my small bed at the back of the house. Grandma sat near my feet, the lamplight flickering soft gold over the wrinkles of her face. I'd been crying. I don't remember why, but I can still recall the blurred sting of tears and the metallic taste of the small cut on my lip I kept touching with my tongue. Grandma sat patiently, wiping my cheeks with a tissue, her expression half worry, half something I couldn't name. Then, without saying anything, she stood and walked across the room, straight to the cupboard. That cupboard. Even now, thinking about it fills me with the same chill that used to creep over me back then, that quiet, inconvenient fear that only kids seem to have, the kind that hides just behind logic. The cupboard was old, made of dark wood that always creaked when you touched it. I never liked sleeping with my back to it. Whenever the house settled or the pipes groaned, I used to picture its doors slowly swinging open and something crawling out, something thin and patient, waiting for me to fall asleep. I never told anyone about those fears. I wasn't stupid. I knew it sounded childish, even at 7. So when Grandma pressed her wrinkled cheek to the cupboard door and whispered something under her breath, every inch of me seized up. The light in the room seemed to dim just a fraction. "Grandma," I'd whispered. "Grandma, what are you doing?" She didn't answer, not right away. She just kept her eyes closed and kept on whispering. And then suddenly she turned, smiling the way she always did when she was about to start one of her stories. She shuffled back to the edge of my bed and sat down. "Did I ever tell you about the special knock, sweetheart?" I shook my head. "No," she said softly. Maybe I was waiting until you were older. It's not a story for everyone. The special knock can be quite wonderful. It can show you things beyond dreams, but it can also be dangerous." Grandma's blue eyes darted toward my bedroom door before coming back to rest on me. "Maybe it's better I save this one." She started to rise from the bed. "It's late, and I wouldn't want to frighten you before sleep." "No, don't go," I said quickly. "Please, Grandma, what's the special knock?" Her lips curved into a tiny smile, and she sank back down. All right then, she said, but you must listen carefully. She reached into the front pocket of her cardigan and pulled out 2 boiled sweets, her signature move. She handed one to me. I hesitated. I'd already brushed my teeth, but this was between us, one of our secrets. I unwrapped it and popped it into my mouth, the sweet sticking to my tongue. When I was over by your cupboard, Grandma began, lowering her voice, I was saying special words, magic words, very old ones. Do you know what those words do? I shook my head again. They turn an ordinary door into a kind of window, she whispered. A gateway. The thing is, sweetheart, this place you call home, your house, your school, your town, it's not the only world. There are other places too. And if you use the special knock on that cupboard door now, that I've whispered the words, you can see them. You won't be able to walk through, but you'll be able to look. The sweet grew smaller on my tongue. I think I forgot to breathe. Now, Grandma continued, there's one thing you must remember. The knock has to be exact. Perfect. 7 knocks, no more, no less. That will open a window to something beautiful. The woman who taught me called it the lunar plane. It's a place of shining lights and strange colors, a world unlike anything you can imagine. She smiled at me then, and for a second she looked both proud and sad, like someone remembering something long lost. Then she leaned back, her expression sobering. But, she said gently, if you get the number wrong, if you knock too many times, you could end up seeing something else. What do you mean? I asked. Well, she said, glancing over at the cupboard again, let's make sure you never find out. Because if you knock 13 times, or anywhere close to it, things can go very wrong. You don't want to open the door to the Blacklands. A shiver tickled down my spine. I glanced at the cupboard, which now seemed to sit heavier in the room, its dark edges swallowing light. What's that? I whispered. Grandma leaned over, kissed my forehead, and whispered, you don't want to know. For the next week, I avoided that cupboard like my life depended on it. Every night, I'd crawl into bed and keep my back pressed to the wall, forcing myself not to look directly at it. But no matter how hard I tried, it was like the thing was pulling at me. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, a curious sort of pressure that lived behind my eyes. The longer I ignored it, the stronger it got. When I closed my eyes, I sometimes dreamt strange dreams, ones that felt too vivid to be ordinary. Sometimes they were soft and warm, glowing skies, drifting lights, a feeling of pure peace. I'd wake from those smiling, as if I'd caught the tail end of something divine. But more often, the dreams were dark. In those, I wasn't anywhere, just standing alone in pitch blackness with an endless wind howling around me. I couldn't see, couldn't move. I only knew somehow that I wasn't the only one there. A week later, I broke Grandma's rule. It was a Saturday night, and my best friend from school, Tim Jacobs, was over for a sleepover. Tim was a month younger than me, but he always seemed older, tall for his age, with blonde, messy hair and a quick smirk that made teachers sigh and girls giggle. He was popular, reckless, and far cooler than I'd ever been. Our dads were old friends, which was really the only reason we hung out. When are you going to get a TV in your room? Tim muttered from the chair near my desk, flicking the lamp on and off. Or a game console? Or something? He looked annoyed. Every time he came over, he complained about my lack of fun things. No games, no computer, just books and board games. You know I'm not allowed, I said in a low voice. It was past 10 p.m., and we'd already been warned by my mom once for talking. I thought maybe he'd let it go, but Tim was restless. He clicked the lamp again, speaking between flashes of light. You know what I think? Click, light. I think your mom, click, dark, is a bitch. Click, light again. His grin widened at saying the word, the forbidden thrill of it. I looked away to hide the sting behind my eyes and saw the cupboard sitting there in the shadows. I know something we can do, I said quietly. If it's another board game, I'm not playing. It's not, I said. My heart started thudding. It's a secret, something someone showed me. He leaned forward. Yeah? What kind of secret? The magical kind, I said. If I do a special knock on that door, we can see another world. He snorted. Yeah, right. I'm serious. A witch told me how. She cast a spell on that cupboard, and now I can make it show us something amazing. But only if the knock is right. He raised an eyebrow. And What happens if it's wrong? I hesitated. Then you see somewhere bad. Somewhere you don't want to see. Tim smirked. You're full of crap. Guess you're too scared to find out. That did it. Tim hated being called scared. His smirk vanished. Go on then, he said, folding his arms. Show me. I walked up to the cupboard, my bare feet brushing the carpet. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the room. I swallowed hard, remembering Grandma's voice. 7 knocks. No more, no less. My hand trembled as I raised it. Knock. The sound was dull, like the door was hollow. Knock. Knock. By the 4th knock, the air began to hum a soft, low vibration that came from somewhere deep behind the wood. Knock. Knock. By the 6th, it sounded almost like a distant song, a whistling breath moving through the cracks. Knock. The 7th knock echoed. I stepped back, heart racing. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows trembling slightly. And underneath it all was the faintest sound, a slow, low humming from inside the cupboard itself. I reached for the handle, half hypnotized. And then Tim shoved me aside. Before I could say a word, he started pounding on the door. Bang, 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 bang. 6 more times. 13 total. The whistling stopped. The air went silent, thicker somehow. Tim laughed and grabbed the door handle again, twisting it with a grin. Oh, come on, he said. Let's see your magic. He never finished the sentence, because something on the other side knocked back. Ever since the memory of my 5th birthday returned to me, that question has echoed in my head again and again. I wish I had an answer. Maybe I shouldn't be so surprised. After all, this is the same grandmother who told me about Mr. Longfingers and the story of the special knock. With her, every bedtime tale had a dark heart. This one feels different, deeper. Wrong in a way none of the others were. The memory had been buried for years. It took weeks of therapy, hours of probing beneath the surface of old dreams to drag it out into the light. But now it's back, almost too vividly. The smell of wax candles, the dim yellow glow of the bedside lamp, the shape of the gift she gave me, the one that sat beside my bed that night like a secret I never wanted. Grandma, will you tell me a story before bed? She had been halfway to the door when I spoke. I remember how she stopped, one hand on the frame, her body turning slightly toward me. I didn't want her to leave. The bedroom felt too dark. Shadows swallowed the shapes of my toys lined up on the dresser. But more than the darkness, more than anything else, it was the gift she'd given me that unnerved me, her little secret present. It wasn't like my main birthday gift, the box of monsters in my pocket toys I'd opened earlier that day. This one was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and she'd given it to me after the party when everyone else had gone home. Just between us, she had said. Even hours later, sitting on my bedside table, it gave me the creeps. A story? Grandma said, her voice soft but amused. What kind of story would you like tonight? I usually let her pick. Grandma only ever told one kind anyway, scary ones. But that night, maybe because the room felt wrong, maybe because of that present, I did something I almost never did. Nothing too scary, Grandma. She raised her eyebrows. Not too scary? I shook my head. She chuckled under her breath, then walked back and turned on the light. The glow softened her face, but it didn't make me feel safer. Out of the corner of my eye, I could still see the small figure sitting on my bedside table, watching. Well, Grandma said, settling on the edge of my bed, smoothing her skirt, I think I'll tell you a story about a witch. Once upon a time, she began, there was a girl who lived with her mother and grandmother in a little cottage by the sea. The girl was bright and full of life. She went to school, collected seashells, painted when the weather was bad. She loved her home, her family, and her quiet little world. One afternoon, walking back from school, she met a boy on the narrow path by the cliffs. She had seen him before he wore the same blue school uniform she did, but they'd never spoken. His tie was loose, his shirt untucked, a cigarette pinched between his fingers. Where are you off to? He asked, smiling. The girl hesitated. Her mother had warned her not to talk to strangers and never to go near anyone who smoked. But was this boy truly a stranger? He went to the same school. Wasn't that like being family, in a way? I'm on my way home, she said politely. He flicked his cigarette into the grass and grinned. Want to see something cool before you go? The girl shook her head. I can't. I'll be late. But before she walked away, the boy said something else, the words that made her stop. It's a puppy, he said. Our dog had a litter. Dad said I could keep one. It's in a barn near my house. Want to see it? The girl loved dogs more than anything. The thought of a soft, warm puppy made her forget all caution. She thought of how tiny it might be, how its little tail might wag happily when it saw her. What harm could it do, she told herself, to take a quick look. So she followed him. They walked over a stile and across a wide, empty field that glowed gold in the evening light. The wind smelled of salt from the sea. The barn rose up on the other side, its walls leaning inward like old bones. It's just inside, said the boy, taking her hand. His palm was hot and damp. She followed him into the dim morning shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. Back here, he whispered. He'll be so excited to see you. They walked deeper, past hay bales and old tools. When the laughter started behind her two deeper voices, she froze. She turned and saw them. Two older boys stepping out from the shadows. That's when fear turned into something worse. When the girl finally stumbled home, the sun was bleeding into the ocean. The water looked red as spilled paint. She reached the cottage just as the light disappeared and collapsed, sobbing inside the doorway. Her grandmother found her there. Now, her grandmother was old, very old, and her eyes always seemed to hold more secrets than she ever said aloud. The girl had been scared of her as a child. But that night, the old woman gathered her up gently, whispering that everything would be all right, that she could tell her anything. Inside that dark hallway, the girl told her everything. About the boy, the barn, the laughter, the unspeakable things. When the story was done, the old woman did not cry. She only took the girl by the hand and said, "Come with me." The grandmother's bedroom always felt strange, full of old paintings, faded photographs, and carvings that looked like they should have belonged in a museum. The air smelled of dust and candle wax, but the girl felt too hollow to notice. Her grandmother guided her to sit on a wooden chair in the middle of the room. "There's a way to protect you," she said softly. "A way to make sure they can never hurt you again. A way to control them." She kneeled down and pulled an old wooden box from beneath her wardrobe. When she opened it, the girl gasped. Inside were dozens of knitted dolls, all the same flesh-colored yarn, all with blank faces except for their eyes. Every doll had glass eyes stitched in, and they seemed to follow her wherever she moved. The old woman chose 3 dolls and set them on the carpet side by side. Then she shut her eyes and muttered words under her breath, words that made the air feel heavy and wrong. When she opened them again, she reached for her knitting needles and a coil of black yarn. "Tell me what they looked like," the grandmother said quietly. "Those boys who hurt you." The girl's throat felt tight, but she spoke. She told her grandmother everything she could remember, their faces, their hair, their shapes. And as she did, the clicking sound of knitting needles filled the room. The smell of salt and yarn and smoke mixed in the air. Outside, the ocean swallowed the last of the red sun. When the dolls were finished, the grandmother placed them in the girl's hands. "As long as you keep these safe," she said, "those boys will never touch you again." And she was right. They never did. 2 days later, the girl was sitting by the window watching the waves when her grandmother burst through the door, pale and shaking. She was clutching a newspaper. The headline read, "3 brothers found tortured and killed in coastal barn." "Agatha," the old woman whispered the girl's name. "Oh, Agatha, dear God, what did you do?" But Agatha only smiled. She smiled and took her grandmother gently by the hand, leading her upstairs into her bedroom. When she opened the small cupboard beside her bed, the old woman gasped. Inside lay a shoebox, and inside the box, 3 knitted dolls. Each was pierced again and again with sewing pins, their faces dark with burns. "What did you do, Agatha?" her grandmother whispered again. Agatha squeezed her grandmother's trembling hands and smiled sweetly. "They won't hurt anyone else now," she said. Grandma finished her story right there. She stood up, turned off the bedside lamp, and said, "You see, sweetheart, I gave you one with a happy ending." I lay in the dark, my stomach turning. I didn't understand every part of what she'd told me, but I understood enough to make me wish she hadn't told it. Then something hit me, a detail that made the hairs on my arms lift. "Grandma," I said softly, "isn't your name Agatha?" She paused in the doorway, her face half hidden in the shadows. "Time to sleep now, Christopher," she whispered. She leaned over, kissed my forehead, and added, "And remember that present I gave you is always there if you ever need it." She smiled, then slipped out, closing the door quietly behind her. I stared after her in silence for a long time. Eventually, my eyes drifted back toward the bedside table. The knitted doll sat waiting there, perfectly still, its face blank except for its two glass eyes wide open, glinting faintly in the dark, staring straight at me. This story takes me back to when I was around 10 or 11 years old, still living in the Philippines under the care of my Lolo and Lola. Our house was old, so old that even the wind seemed to make it groan. The floorboards squeaked, the stairs ached under every step, and sometimes at night it felt like the whole place breathed with its own uneasy rhythm. The bottom floor was mostly wood dark, worn smooth from years of foot traffic, while the upper floor had thick stone walls that never stopped whispering, always settling, always shifting. My room was downstairs, right at the base of the wooden staircase. It was small, with a single bed pressed against the corner and one window that looked out onto the garden where the guava trees grew. The top of the stairs led to a long, narrow hallway that always stayed too dark, even in the daytime. At the end of that hallway was my grandparents' bedroom. They slept up there together, and every night, just before bed, I could hear them walking overhead, their slow steps moving back and forth as they prepared to sleep. Lolo and Lola both worked night shifts, so they had to leave home earlier than most people. I remember the sound of their shoes at around 1 in the morning, the clink of keys, the quiet whisper of prayers before they stepped out. Then the door would click shut and silence would take their place. It was a silence that felt wrong, like the whole house waited for something. And that was when it started. The footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A soft thud, then another, coming from directly above me, my grandparents' room. The sound was faint but clear enough to make my skin prickle. It went thud, 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 slow and steady, crossing the room, pausing for a few seconds, then coming back. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. The weight behind each step told me it wasn't the house settling. Someone was up there. The first time it happened, I froze in bed, too afraid to move. I pulled my blanket up to my chin and stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm. 3 steps, pause, 3 more, pause. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, or maybe a stray sound from outside. But it went on for nearly an hour before stopping all at once, the kind of sudden quiet that makes your heart race even faster. The next morning, I told Lolo and Lola what I had heard. Lola just smiled softly and said, "The house makes noise, Anak. It's old. Wood always moves at night." Lolo chuckled and patted my shoulder, saying the same thing. "You're just not used to it. Try to pray before bed." They were kind, but I knew they didn't believe me. But I wasn't confused. I grew up in that house. I knew the difference between random creaks and someone walking. That heavy rhythm didn't come from wood, it came from footsteps. Weeks passed, and the noise continued every few nights, always after my grandparents left. Sometimes it woke me up, other times it kept me from sleeping altogether. It became a strange routine. 1 in the morning, the sound of the door closing, then the creaks. Then the footsteps above my room, pacing slowly, as if someone restless was trapped in that space, unable to leave. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. My fear had slowly turned into frustration, and I told myself I needed to prove that something or someone was up there. The footsteps started again, louder this time, like they were pressing down harder. The house groaned with every step. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering so fast it felt like it might break through my chest. I turned on my bedside lamp, the weak glow barely cutting through the darkness. I could still hear the slow rhythm thud, thud, thud. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and started up the stairs. Each step bowed and hissed under my weight. Halfway up, the footsteps stopped. The silence hit me like ice water. No sound, no movement, just the creaks of the house holding its breath. I stopped too, frozen mid-step. For a few long seconds, I couldn't tell if the quiet was comforting or worse. Then another realization hit me. It was listening. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep going. Step by step, I climbed until I reached the hallway. I flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered, then steadied, revealing the long hall stretching ahead. The open door to my grandparents' room, waiting like a mouth in the dark. "Lola?" I whispered. "Lolo?" No answer. I pushed the door open wider. Everything inside was exactly as they'd left it. The neatly folded blanket, the rosary on the bedside table, the window shut tight. No movement, no wind, just stillness. I stood there for a moment, my heart trying to convince my brain I was safe. Then I turned to go downstairs again. That's when I heard it. Thud, thud, thud. The footsteps started up again inside the very room I had just checked. My breath caught. I turned back, my vision tunneling with panic. There was nothing there. The window curtains hung motionless, the air still heavy. But the pacing continued, clear and firm. Back and forth, back and forth. I bolted. Down the hall, down the stairs. My feet barely touched the steps as I ran, tears stinging my eyes. I reached my room, slammed the door shut, and dove under the blanket. I stayed that way until the first light of morning. When I told my grandparents what had happened, they looked at each other. For a moment, they didn't speak. Then Lola forced a laugh, the sound thinner than usual. "Anak, it's just your imagination," she said. Lolo added that sometimes old wood sounds different when rain's coming. But I saw at the quick flicker of worry in their eyes, the one they tried to hide. That night, they left again for work, and as soon as I heard the click of the door, the footsteps returned. They were louder, angrier, like whoever was up there was frustrated with me for coming too close. The house moaned around me. Every soft gust of wind made the windows tremble. My heart ached with fear, but I didn't move. I couldn't. All I did was pray silently until the sound finally faded just before dawn. Months passed before I had anyone else stay in that room. Then came the night my older cousin stayed over for the weekend. He was 14, taller than me, and always teased me about being scared of silly things. When I told him about the footsteps, he just laughed. "Ghosts aren't real. You watch too much TV," he said, but I begged him to listen that night. As always, Lolo and Lola left around 1 in the morning. The silence settled like dust, and then, right on time, it came. Thud, thud, thud. My cousin sat upright so quickly his blanket slipped to the floor. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. My whole body was trembling. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, from one end of the hallway to the other. Slow, steady, too heavy to be a rat or a cat. The sound followed the same pattern I'd heard so many times before. 3 steps, pause, 3 more, turn. There was a long pause, and then the sound shifted. The footsteps moved again, this time directly above us. The ceiling groaned under each step. My cousin's hand grabbed my arm, squeezing tight. His voice was barely a whisper. "Don't move, don't look." Then came another sound, a deep scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor upstairs. It went on for a few seconds, followed by a loud crash. Something had fallen over. My cousin jumped up, locked our bedroom door, then pressed his back against it, pale as a ghost. We sat in quiet terror for the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep, barely daring to breathe. When morning came, and Lolo and Lola returned from work, they found us sitting on the floor, pale and wide-eyed. My cousin blurted everything before I could even speak. This time, my grandparents didn't laugh. Lola's hands trembled as she reached for her rosary. Lolo's brow furrowed deeply. They exchanged one of those long, heavy looks that mean more than any words could. Then finally, Lola said softly, "We didn't want to frighten you, Anak, but your Lolo's father died in that upstairs room, and since then, sometimes we hear him walking too." Lolo nodded slowly. "He couldn't sleep much," he murmured, "always pacing. Maybe he still is." The rest of that day passed quietly, but the air in the house felt different, heavier. I tried to tell myself that knowing the truth should make it easier, but somehow it made everything worse. The idea that the ghost wasn't a stranger but part of our own family sent colder shivers through me than anything else. Even after we moved years later, the memory never left me. Sometimes when I'm home alone and the house gets too quiet, I'll think I hear it again. That careful, deliberate rhythm moving through empty rooms. Thud, thud, thud. A sound as familiar as breath. And every time, I freeze, half expecting to look up and see an old man pacing above me in the dark, still waiting, still restless, never quite ready to sleep. If you're still here listening, and these stories are keeping you company while you drift off, take a second to like the video and subscribe to True Nightmares. So there's always another long, creepy episode waiting for your next sleepless night. The fog moved like something alive. It crawled over the ground in thick waves, clinging cold and damp to Micah's face. The last traces of sunset bled away in the distance, swallowed by the gray haze that drifted through blackout woods. The trees loomed around him, crooked silhouettes fading away into the mist, their jagged branches interlocking like bony fingers. It felt less like a forest and more like a maze that did not want him to leave. Micah tightened his grip on Aiden's hand. It was sweaty, trembling slightly. Behind them, the dark swallowed the path until even the footprints they had left were gone. "We should turn back," Aiden said in a shaky voice that barely rose above the wind. "Micah, I don't like this place. It feels wrong." Micah didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the thickening fog that pulsed faintly with pale light between the trees. He had to keep going. There were answers buried here, and he needed them more than he needed to breathe. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, her last warning, given on the night she died. "Stay away from blackout woods. The blood remembers." He'd laughed at her then, writing it off as strange talk from an old, dying woman. But even after her funeral, her words followed him. He'd started dreaming of the woods, seeing flashes of symbols carved into stone, hearing voices whispering from the dark. Now, standing in that same fog, he wasn't laughing anymore. "Micah," Aiden hissed, jerking at his sleeve. "I'm serious. We shouldn't." That was when he heard it. A whisper so faint it could have been the wind. "Micah." It was soft, delicate, the kind of sound that slips straight beneath your skin. It sent ice flowing through his veins. He stopped walking, the fog trembling around him like it had been disturbed. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Aiden's eyes darted nervously through the mist. "Hear what?" But before Micah could answer, it came again. "Micah, come home." It floated through the trees like a melody made of dry leaves. The voice was no longer alone, more whispers followed, joining in. A soft, rasping chorus that carried his name again and again until it became rhythm, then song. Micah, come back, come home." It was everywhere at once, behind them, above them, beneath their feet. The air thickened as if the forest itself was leaning in to listen. Micah spun around, holding his phone out, the flashlight beam cutting a thin white line through the fog. The light hit a cluster of old trees, their bark split and warped, the knots twisting into faces frozen in silent screams. He could almost swear they were watching him. Something brushed his shoulder cold and electric, like static air just before lightning strikes. He whipped around again, but saw nothing except mist. His breath fogged in front of him, and the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. The beam of his flashlight flickered across the trunk of an immense oak, the largest tree in the clearing. Its bark was blackened, split down the middle as if struck by lightning long ago. But it wasn't the damage that froze him. It was what was carved there. Symbols. The same runes his grandmother had once shown him in an old leather-bound bookmarks she had called the family's curse. Lines joined by circles and slashes, etched deep into the wood like old wounds that never healed. He remembered her hands trembling when she turned the pages, her eyes unfocused as she told him about their ancestors' mistake, a ritual that should never have been performed. Now, standing in front of those symbols, Micah knew they were real. Whispers rose all around, no longer gentle but frantic, gasping, desperate. "Micah, join us, join us." The voices blended together, breaking the silence like waves crashing against rock. Blood calls to blood. His stomach twisted as he realized what they were saying. This wasn't just a haunted forest. This place was a binding ground, a prison filled with the restless spirits of those who came before him, his family. The ritual they performed had failed, trapping them here, chained to the forest that had become both tomb and home. And now they wanted him to finish what they started. He turned toward Aiden. "We need to go, now." But Aiden didn't move. He stood completely still, his head tilted back slightly, eyes glassy as though he were staring through Micah, not at him. His lips parted. When he spoke, his voice was layered and hollow, not his own. "Micah." The single word sounded like it came from miles away, though his mouth moved inches from Micah's face. "We've been waiting for you." Micah's heart kicked wildly in his chest. "Aiden, stop it. This isn't funny." He grabbed his friend's shoulders and shook him, but Aiden's body was cold and rigid, like stone under his jacket. The fog began to swirl faster, the earth vibrating beneath their feet. Whispers became screams, hundreds of them, overlapping, rising to a deafening pitch. "Blood calls to blood. Join us, join us." Aiden's smile widened, unnatural and empty. "It's time to come home," he said, in the same layered voice, dozens of tones echoing inside his words. Micah stumbled back. "No," he whispered, then louder, "You're not him." He turned and bolted, but the fog came alive. From within it, cold hands burst out, hundreds of them, gray and skeletal, clawing at his jacket, wrapping around his arms and legs. The whispers followed, weaving promises into his ears: power, immortality, family. They told him he could belong, that they could make him whole again. Every lie sounded true when wrapped in those voices. He fought, tearing through the fog, stumbling over roots he couldn't see. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on him as he ran, every breath rasping in his throat. Somewhere behind him, he heard Aiden's laughter, high and distorted, echoing through the trees like something inhuman. When he tripped and fell to his knees, the ground felt alive. The dirt pulsed under his palms, warm and wet, like the skin of something breathing. He squeezed his eyes shut as the voices thundered inside his skull. "Join us. You are one of us. Let go." He screamed back at them, though he couldn't tell if any sound left his mouth. The chorus grew shrill, 1,000 whispers collapsing into a roar, and then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The silence that followed rang louder than the noise had. Micah opened his eyes, panting. The fog was gone. The trees stood still and colorless beneath a clear night sky. The moon hung full and impossibly bright above him. And Aiden was there, kneeling beside him, blinking as if waking from a dream. What happened?" Aiden asked. His voice was his own again, weak but familiar. "I feel like I blacked out." Micah stared at him, words caught in his throat. He wanted to collapse in relief, but something about Aiden's expression didn't quite sit right. Still, he forced a shaky smile and got to his feet. "It's over," he said softly. "Let's go home." Together, they walked back through the forest. The fog didn't return. The woods were quiet, except for the crunch of leaves beneath their shoes. For the first time all day, Micah thought maybe everything was truly finished. Maybe his mind had twisted his grandmother's stories into something more than they were. Halfway through the path, he glanced back one last time. The trees stood tall and silent, thin shadows stretching across the ground. Nothing stirred. He exhaled the breath he'd been holding, almost believing they'd escaped. Almost. Aiden's hand tightened around his. Micah's relief evaporated at the cold that seeped through his skin. He looked down and felt his stomach drop. The hand wasn't Aiden's, the skin was pale, thin, stretched tight over bones that didn't bend quite right. Long, bony fingers clasped around his own with unnatural strength. He lifted his gaze slowly, dread crawling up his spine. Aiden was looking back at him, but his eyes weren't his anymore. The warmth, the light, all gone. What stared out at Micah was a hollow darkness, ancient and endless, like the woods themselves had taken root inside him. A skeletal smile spread across Aiden's face. "Let's go home," he whispered, the voice not his own. Micah's breath hitched. The forest around them seemed to exhale a faint hiss carried by the wind, almost like laughing. The fog began to roll back in, creeping low to the ground, swirling around their legs. It brushed against Micah's ankles like fingers reaching for him again. He couldn't move. The whispers returned, softer this time but more intimate, a kind of purring satisfaction in them. Blood remembers. It was then he understood. The ritual hadn't wanted him. It wanted Aiden. Or rather, it wanted someone alive to bring back what was lost. To finish the pact. Now, Aiden wasn't just possessed, he was gone. Micah tore his hand away and stumbled backward, heart slamming against his ribs. The fog swallowed Aiden's figure whole, darkness spreading from his body across the ground like spilled ink. The forest went silent except for one final whisper, carried on the wind. "Welcome home, Micah." And then the trees closed around him once more. I have always loved trains. There's something deeply peaceful about them, the way they glide through miles of open country, stitching together towns and landscapes like silver thread through green and gray cloth. Unlike planes or buses, they let you drift, think, and watch the world slide by in silence. Last autumn, I decided to give myself a small gift, a solo sleeper journey from London to Inverness. I wanted the romance of the Caledonian sleeper, the idea of falling asleep in the heart of the city and waking up among the windswept mountains of the Scottish Highlands. Every friend who'd taken it told me the same thing. There was something magical about dozing off under city lights and opening your eyes to mist and wilderness. The cabin was small but charming, tidy in that meticulous way only British trains seem to manage. 2 narrow bunks lined one wall, with a fold-down sink tucked neatly in the corner and a single window pressed against the night. Outside, the reflection of my own face lingered like a ghost against endless darkness. I boarded just before midnight at London Euston, still buzzing a little from the city's noise. The cabin attendant greeted me warmly, her voice clipped yet kind, a Scottish lilt, softened by years of working with sleepy travelers. She offered me a mug of hot chocolate and a miniature bottle of whiskey to help you drift off, love. I took both with a grin, feeling a flutter of childlike excitement at this odd adventure. By 12:45 a.m., London and its suburbs had dissolved into the black nothingness beyond the tracks. The wheels hummed beneath me, an endless whisper of steel. I lay on the lower bunk, my small lamp spilling amber light across the room as I finished the last pages of my book. Each sway of the train lulled me closer to drowsiness. Finally, I yawned one of those long, heavy yawns that seemed to drain every bone in your body and placed the book on the small table by the window. I turned out the light. For a while, I simply listened to the low thrum of the engine, the faint whistle of wind seeping through old seams, the almost rhythmic creak of metal against metal. Everything about it felt soothing, hypnotic, a lullaby of motion. The train's rocking became my heartbeat. My eyelids grew heavier. And then, through that calm, something else broke the rhythm. A sound, soft, fragile as breath. At first, I didn't even register it as words, just something barely there, floating through the corridor, blending with the whisper of the wheels. Help! I opened my eyes, unsure if I'd dreamed it. My watch read 1:17 a.m. The train continued gliding forward, the rhythm unchanged, the night pressing cold and indifferent against the windows. I lay very still, listening. Nothing followed. Maybe one of the other passengers had spoken in their sleep. Maybe it had just been the rails singing. Just the rails, I muttered under my breath, half to convince myself. I tugged the blankets tighter around me and closed my eyes again. Seconds stretched into minutes. The soft hum of travel returned, steady and reassuring. And then, again, closer this time. Please, help. Every nerve in my body snapped awake. That wasn't the train. I bolted upright, heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. The voice had been distinct, now muffled, distant, but unmistakably human, and terrified. I climbed off the bunk, feet unsteady on the moving floor, and pressed my ear against the cabin door. Nothing. No footsteps in the corridor, no whispers, just the sound of the wheels grinding softly below. The hall on the other side of the door was faintly lit. A golden haze seeped through the thin crack beneath it. I hesitated, then unlocked the door with shaking fingers and pulled it open just a few inches. The corridor was empty. The faint scent of polish and cold metal hung in the air. Shadows shifted slightly as the train turned around a curve. Far ahead, the hallway bent out of sight, the lights humming in patient stillness. There was no one there, no sound except the rhythmic sway of the carriage. A chill ran down my spine. I closed the door, locked it again, and leaned against it, trying to breathe slowly. It was nothing, I told myself. Probably the sound of someone's radio in another cabin, the faint noise warped by distance. But the words had seemed so close, so deliberate. Minutes passed. I sat there until the ache in my legs told me to lie down again. The moment I did, exhaustion swept over me. I wrapped the blanket around my head like a cocoon and promised myself I wouldn't let my imagination ruin what was meant to be a magical journey. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. "Please, miss, will you help me?" My eyes flew open. The voice was above me, clear and desperate, right there in the room. The top bunk. My throat closed up. I couldn't even gasp. I just stared at the wooden underside of the upper bunk, my pulse hammering so loudly that I thought the entire cabin must hear it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Please, miss," came the voice again. "You have to help me. Please." It was the voice of a child, a young boy. Slowly, I reached under the covers for my phone, fumbling with trembling fingers. My hand shook so much, I nearly dropped it before I could unlock the screen. When I did, I saw exactly what I expected. No signal. Of course, we were deep in the highlands by now, between mountains and nothingness. The train was its own world, sealed, suspended. I switched on the flashlight instead. The circular cone of light trembled across the room. No one, no movement, but the sheets on the top bunk rustled softly, the unmistakable sound of weight shifting across fabric. My skin prickled from scalp to heel. The ladder beside the bunk creaked, slowly, one rung, then another. Someone or something was climbing down. I screamed. The sound tore out of me before I could think. I must have startled half the carriage, because seconds later came a frantic knocking on my door. "Are you all right?" It was a man's voice, accompanied by the terrified cabin attendant. I rushed to the door, stumbling to unlock the bolt. When it swung open, I almost collapsed into the light of the corridor, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. "Miss," she said urgently, eyes wide with concern. "What's happened?" I tried to explain. The words came in bursts between sobs, the whispering boy, the voice above me, the ladder moving. Her expression softened but didn't quite change. The man beside her frowned, clearly unconvinced. The attendant reached out, touching my arm lightly. "It's all right, dear," she said gently. "You've had a fright, that's all. Happens sometimes on the sleeper. The rhythm, the sound, it can cause something like a night terror. Would you like to move cabins, just to feel safer?" I couldn't even speak. I just nodded. She guided me toward another compartment at the far end of the carriage. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing out the dark corridor. She handed me another hot chocolate, the steam curling between us, and gave a faint, awkward hug before wishing me good night. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the journey. The wheels sang their endless tune against the rails. Every shuffle of the wind made me flinch. Each echo in the corridor became the whisper of a voice that shouldn't exist. Hours stretched thin and colorless until the faint glow of dawn began to bleed through the edges of the window. When the train finally slowed into Inverness, I felt like I'd survived something rather than traveled. The platform mist rolled low over the air, curling between golden streaks of early light. I stepped down, the weight of my suitcase dragging behind me. For the first time since the night began, the world was utterly still. Steam hissed softly from beneath the engine as if the train were sighing in relief. I glanced once more through the carriage windows as I passed along the platform. There it was, my cabin, the first one I'd stayed in, its door now neatly closed. Nothing seemed unusual. A perfectly ordinary sleeping berth on a perfectly ordinary train. I told myself I had imagined it. The mind can spin strange things in the dark, especially when lulled by sleeplessness and the motion of the rails. Satisfied enough to believe my own lie, I turned toward the station stairs. That was when I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost affectionate, carried just beneath the hiss of steam. "Thank you, miss." I froze. Every hair along my arms stood on end. The train groaned and began to move again. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I walked away, the whisper still threading itself through my thoughts as the Caledonian sleeper slipped northward, carrying its secrets deeper into the highlands. I couldn't believe my luck when I got the email a week before Halloween. I finally received my first real work placement from my library technician program. My assignment? The children's section of the local public library. Most of my classmates were going to spend their placements shelving books, filling request carts, or cataloging endless lists of reference materials. But I was getting paid to cut out construction paper pumpkins, sing Halloween songs with preschoolers, and probably eat my body weight in candy corn. It felt more like an early holiday present than a job. The library itself was exactly what a Halloween lover like me would dream of. It was old, one of the oldest buildings in town, built of Gothic stone with ivy creeping along its walls. It had gargoyles perched on the roof and a steep spiral staircase leading to its dusty archives, with the kind of character you only found in history books. You could almost imagine a ghost librarian haunting its towers, whispering, "Quiet, please," from behind carved wooden doors. I was completely enchanted from the moment I stepped inside. I threw myself into decorating like a kid, hyped up on too much sugar. I spent hours cutting smiling black cats and hanging paper bats from the ceiling. I sang Halloween songs under my breath as I worked, and on more than one occasion, I found myself skipping down the hallways, humming the Ghostbusters theme. I think I was more excited about the upcoming children's party than some of the staff. By the middle of the week, the head librarian, a kind older woman named Mrs. Bentley, had to leave early for a dentist's appointment. She handed me a clipboard, gave a grateful smile, and said, "You can manage things here, can't you? You're a bright one." "Of course," I said enthusiastically, and I meant it. Spending the last hour alone with the Halloween crafts was my idea of heaven. My workspace was one of the small offices in the basement, a cozy little space lined with filing cabinets, boxes of craft supplies, and old library posters from the 70s telling kids to read more books. I had set up at the desk with a stack of paper zombie puppets, waiting to be cut out and colored for the next day's event. I put some upbeat music on my phone, propped the door open with a heavy metal stopper so it wouldn't get too stuffy, and got to work coloring in crooked smiles and goofy eyes. It was peaceful down there, a perfect end to a good day. When I finished cutting out the last puppet, I leaned back in my chair, admiring my handiwork. Feeling smug, I snapped a quick picture of the small army of paper zombies and texted it to my classmate Jen, who had texted earlier complaining about her own day of monotonous shelf reading. I added the caption, "Meanwhile, I'm preparing for the zombie apocalypse." After sending it, I began tidying up, stacking the finished puppets neatly, closing the colored pencil boxes, and shutting down my music. Without the background noise, the silence settled thickly around me. I could faintly hear the muffled hum of the building's heating system and the occasional groan of the old wooden floorboards above. It struck me then just how alone I was. Not an uncomfortable loneliness exactly, but the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The basement walls, made of thick old stone, seemed to swallow even the faintest noise. When I reached the doorway, I decided to close up for the evening. As almost an afterthought, I nudged the heavy doorstop with my foot so the door could swing shut behind me. Except it didn't. The door stayed half open, unmoving. I frowned. Maybe it had caught on the carpet or wedged against something. I leaned in to check, expecting to see a crumpled piece of paper or a box in the way. The floor was perfectly clear. Weird. I nudged the door again, harder this time. It didn't move an inch. "Huh," I said aloud, my voice sounding oddly fragile in the thick silence. Gripping the metal handle, I gave it a firm tug to close it completely. The door felt like it weighed twice as much as before. It resisted me with an unexpected stiffness, like someone was leaning against it from the other side. I hesitated. Then, feeling slightly foolish, I braced both hands against the door and shoved. It gave a little, the hinges groaning softly, and I thought I'd managed to push it shut, until it pushed back. Not gently, either. The pressure was firm, deliberate. Instinctively, I froze. Something wasn't right. Heart skittering in my chest, I leaned to peek back inside the office, half expecting to see someone, a janitor, maybe, or another staff member who had come in quietly. But the office was empty. Still, the door moved again. It wasn't just heavy, it was resisting me, pushing back with its own strength. I tested it, pressing lightly against the wood. A force not strong, but undeniable, pressed right back against my palms. A chill ran up my spine. I let go and stepped back, staring at the motionless crack of light between the door and the frame. My breath hitched as I reached forward again and gave the door a tentative shove. Something on the other side shoved harder. The sound of my pulse grew deafening in my ears. Sweat prickled across my skin. I yanked on the handle, desperate to slam it shut and get out of there, but another push from the other side erased all my progress. Again and again I tried, each time getting nowhere. The air felt heavy and cold all at once, pressing in like invisible fog. And then, I swear I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. Deeper. Harsh. Steady inhales through the door frame, like someone crouched right on the other side. My chest tightened. I was utterly alone down here. There was no one else scheduled to work in the basement that evening. For a long, trembling moment, I stood back from the half-shut door, heart pounding, mind racing for something, anything I could do. No way was I going to pull the door open to see who or what was on the other side. My only option was to finish what I started. I backed up, took a shaking breath, and threw my whole body forward, shoulder first. The impact rattled my teeth. With a thunderous slam, the door finally shut, the metal latch sliding home with a reassuring click. Panting, I leaned against it in triumph and fear all at once. I must have looked like an idiot, but at least the thing was closed. Then, the thud hit so hard, it nearly caved my chest in. The door shuddered on its hinges. The blow had the heavyweight rhythm of fists. 1, 2, then another, louder than before. I stumbled back, my legs barely working. My breath came out in small, panicked gasps as adrenaline rushed through me. That was no random noise. Something had just hit the door like a person furious at being locked out. I didn't stay to find out more. I snatched my bag from the table, bolted up the basement stairs, 2 at a time, and didn't stop running until I burst through the library's front door into the cool night. I didn't call my ride until I was halfway down the street, standing under a street lamp, trembling so hard my phone almost slipped from my hands. I barely slept that night. Every creak of my apartment made me jolt awake. But no matter how terrifying it had been, I knew skipping my placement wasn't an option. Missing a week would tank my grade, and explaining my absence by saying the basement tried to fight me wasn't likely to go over well. The next morning, I forced myself back to the library. When I saw Mrs. Bentley arranging inflatable ghosts for the children's Halloween story hour, I tried to smile as if everything was totally normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feel of that door pressing against me. I debated telling her what happened, what I thought I'd felt, but chickened out at the last moment. She was grading my performance. What if she thought I was losing it? But some part of me still felt I should say something. After all, whatever had happened down there, it didn't feel safe. While helping her staple up paper bats, I decided to test the waters. "Hey," I said casually, trying and failing to sound nonchalant. "Do you ever get creeped out working in the basement? Like, when you're alone?" She paused mid-staple and gave a small sigh, like she'd been waiting for that question. When she turned to look at me, her expression wasn't confused, it was knowing. "Oh," she said simply, "so, you've met him." It took a second for her words to register. "What do you mean, him?" I asked slowly. Apparently, the library had a long reputation for being haunted specifically, its basement. Staff talked about a male presence down there, one that made its displeasure known if disturbed after hours. Mrs. Bentley said she'd personally felt cold drafts, heard heavy footsteps, and even had books fly from shelves with no one nearby. Over the years, she said, every employee who'd worked in the lower level had some story. Doors closing on their own, whispering voices, things moved from one shelf to another overnight. I swallowed hard. "And you're just okay with that?" She gave a helpless sort of laugh. "Well, it is a library. He's never really hurt anyone, just likes to be difficult. We've even got paranormal investigators coming in next month. Supposedly, they'll get to the bottom of it." I didn't find that comforting. She thought it was cool. I thought it was the exact opposite of cool. I would have appreciated a fair warning about this him before being left alone down there. The rest of the week went by without incident, though I refused to so much as glance toward that basement door again. Every time someone mentioned needing supplies from downstairs, I'd suddenly find pressing work upstairs that demanded my attention. On my final day, Mrs. Bentley thanked me for all my help with the children's events and praised my enthusiasm. "The kids adored you," she said kindly. I smiled, but my gaze drifted toward the dark stairwell at the back of the library. I couldn't help shuddering. When my placement ended, I promised myself that nothing, not a grade, not even a full-time job, would ever drag me back down into that basement again. Whatever lives down there, it can keep its dusty archives and paper puppets. Some libraries guard their books. That one guards something else entirely. I've always been something of a skeptic, though not the kind that loudly refuses the possibility of the unexplainable. In some strange way, part of me wants to believe in the supernatural. It would make life feel a little less ordinary, wouldn't it? And sure, I've seen a few odd things, lights in the woods, flickers in mirrors, but nothing that couldn't be explained away with a good dose of logic. I've never found myself face to face with a werewolf, wendigo, or any other cryptid wandering through the mist, though I'll admit, I love listening to those who say they have. I've collected stories for years, hauntings, roadside ghosts, cursed objects, phantom cars. But I had never before come across a story about a haunted recipe, until one fall afternoon when I met Maria. The story unfolded during what should have been an ordinary workday. I drive for a craft brewery, which is, truth be told, a pretty sweet gig. I spend my days crisscrossing the countryside with a truck full of kegs and pallets, dropping off orders at bars, restaurants, and liquor stores. My routes are long, but they take me through some of the most stunning scenery, imaginable rolling forests, little lake towns, distant mountain peaks dusted with snow. Better still, the brewery where I work has a dog-friendly policy extending to its employees, so I get to bring along my co-pilot, Alfred. Alfred is a 30-pound cattle dog mix with tuxedo markings that make him look perpetually overdressed for the job. He's the best companion I could ask for, loyal, quiet, and better at charming bartenders than I'll ever be. That day, we were halfway through our deliveries when Alfred gave a little growl from the seat beside me, his sign that it was lunchtime. Checking my schedule, I saw I had a gap before my next stop, a bar that wouldn't open for another few hours. I scrolled through the list of customers and saw my last stop had been another local brewery that doubled as a restaurant. Brewery food is usually solid sandwiches, cheese plates, maybe a well-made soup of the day. They also understand beer, which, in my mind, makes them trustworthy by default. I looked it up, found pictures online, a cozy place built like an old saloon, all warm wood and brass, and that sealed it. They even had a steak sandwich on the menu. A steak sandwich and a freshly poured ale sounded like the perfect way to break up the day. I pulled into the town a postcard kind of place, where every window had flower boxes, and almost every yard had a beehive or two. It all smelled faintly sweet, like pollen carried in the wind. I parked my truck, hooked Alfred's leash to my belt, and loaded the keg onto my dolly. He trotted cheerfully beside me as we headed toward the brewery, the scent of grilled meat already wafting down the street. The place was exactly as the pictures had shown, an old-timey saloon with swinging double doors and a piano in the corner that looked like it hadn't been played since the 20s. Behind the bar stood a woman wiping down the long stretch of polished wood, her hair tied back in a loose bun. She looked over her shoulder when the doors swung open, her eyes bright, her smile instant. "Well, honey, you've certainly made an entrance," she said, spotting Alfred right away. "A full keg of beer and the cutest dog in the county? That's how you make friends around here." Her accent had the soft drawl of Tennessee or thereabouts, musical and warm. I laughed, feeling my face heat up at the unexpected compliment. Alfred, ever the showman, wagged his tail and flashed that delighted tongue-lolling grin of his. The woman swung the counter latch aside and came around with her hand extended. "Name's Maria." I introduced myself, setting the keg carefully down and shaking her hand. "Alan," I said, "brought your order of Belgian honey ale." Her eyebrows lifted. "Perfect. We'll be serving it at the Nectar Festival this weekend." She gave the barrel an approving pat. "You ready for the bad news?" I smiled, already guessing. "Don't tell me cellar stairs?" She feigned a wince. "Steep ones too. An old place like this, you know how it is." "Of course," I sighed, though I was grinning. Always a workout. She watched as I muscled the dolly toward the trap door, peering down the narrow wooden steps. I popped the latch, propping the door open. Need a hand? She asked, peeking down at me. Light from the doorway framed both her and Alfred's head, like they'd stepped out of a painting. I've got it, I said, although the keg weighed nearly 160 pounds. Not the worst stares I've faced. Bet not, she said with a teasing grin. By the time I rolled the keg into place and came back up, Maria was drawing 2 small glasses of the new ale from the tap. She'd already signed the paperwork by the time I wiped my hands on my jeans and reclaimed my breath. She slid one of the glasses toward me. You earned it, she said. I lifted the beer to my nose first, taking in the aroma a brewer's habit. There was honey, yes, but something else too, floral and sweet, undercut by bright hops. I took a sip. Smooth, balanced. The kind of beer that seemed simple but lingered on your tongue in surprising ways. This is gorgeous, I said. You made this? She smiled. This is my place, she said simply. And that's my recipe. I blinked, impressed. You don't meet many women brewers. It's incredible, I said honestly. What do you call it? Memento mori. That gave me pause. Remember, you will die, I translated aloud. She chuckled. Close. Remember, you have to die. A touch of irony to remind me that even when things end, they can still mean something. She leaned against the bar. There's a story behind that beer, actually, if you've got time. I told her I did. She poured me another half glass and signaled the cook in the back, who appeared moments later with a plate piled high with steak, blue cheese, and caramelized onions. The smell alone nearly made me swoon. I bought this place a few years back, she began, wiping her hands on a towel. It was a wreck then, dust everywhere, paperwork to the ceiling, rats busy running their own business. The last brewer died, and the place shut down. Everyone in town said I was crazy to buy it, but I was hungry to prove myself. She explained how she'd clawed her way into what she called the boys' club of brewing. Despite the mess, she'd seen potential in the old brewery. Cleaning it up took months. Furniture needed repairing, equipment restoring, and then, behind the clutter in an old office, she found a hidden safe. It took me 3 locksmiths and still no luck, she said with a laugh. In the end, I cracked it open myself with an acetylene torch. Inside were old photos, trinkets, and a recipe book. Most of it was standard stuff, lagers, stouts, IPA batches, but one stood out. A honey beer, part Belgian, part ale. The kind of hybrid that only exists in theory. It was the recipe she had used for the brew I was drinking. The timing was perfect, she went on. I wanted to reopen the brewery in time for the town's annual Nectar Festival. She gestured toward the window, where I could faintly see the fields of wildflowers outside. Everyone here grows something for the bees. Every yard's got a hive or two. So I struck a deal with a local beekeeper, grabbed a few buckets of his surplus honey, and decided to brew the beer as my grand opening signature. That's when, she said, the trouble began. I started the brew late, couldn't sleep, too excited. Figured I'd do an all-nighter. My bulldog, Hops, came with me. She nodded to a framed photo of a squishy-faced dog smiling above the register. He got his name because he used to bark and hop at the same time when he was little. Maria described the start of her shift going smoothly until the loud pop of a fuse exploding startled them both. Scared poor Hops so bad, he peed right there on the floor, she said, laughing. The blast left a black scar on the fuse box door. I replaced it, no big deal, and kept going. But every few minutes after that, things started glitching. The lights dimming, equipment stalling. Then came the weirdest part. She paused, refilling our glasses. I was measuring the honey when the power flickered again. It went so dark I could barely see, and I heard this sound, a sort of wet squelching, like something crawling inside the bucket. When the lights came back, the honey wasn't honey anymore. It was seething with maggots. I grimaced. You're kidding. I wish, she said. Dropped it. Nearly screamed. By the time I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on, it was gone. Just honey again. Perfectly fine. Maria shrugged, though her eyes had turned distant. Could have called it stress or power-related hallucination if it stopped there, but it didn't. The night unraveled from there. Equipment started turning on by itself, the grain auger spinning while unplugged, dials jumping. Hops, normally calm, was hysterical, barking at empty corners of the room. I opened the control box to shut down the system, and something tugged my hair, she said quietly. Just a gentle brush, but I felt it. Then bang, another fuse blew. Sparks everywhere. The whole system nearly fried. I shut everything down except the essentials. Her voice lowered, and even the hum of the bar seemed to fade around us. Then came the voices, she said. Two men shouting. I could hear them clear as day from the tap room above. I thought my bartenders had come in after hours, but when I checked, place was empty. That's when I noticed it. The air had changed. The building felt angry. She gave me a sidelong look, as if expecting me to laugh. I didn't. I finished the brew anyway, she continued. Call it stubbornness or ignorance. I climbed up to the bright tank to pitch the yeast, and that's when Hops started barking again, louder than I'd ever heard. He was beneath the tank, losing his mind. I leaned over the hatch to see what had him so riled up, and the latch door blew open. Maria mimed the movement, a swift, brutal motion. Caught my hand, broke 2 fingers clean. If I hadn't already been bent over, it would have launched me 15 feet to the floor. Jesus, I whispered. Yeah, she gave a small laugh. When I finally got the bleeding under control and went to clean it up, the blood was gone. Every drop. Nothing on the ladder, nothing on the floor, like it never happened. She met my eyes. You want to hear the worst of it? I nodded. When I got to the ER, the doctor kept asking me whether I'd fallen or blacked out. Said I looked like someone who'd been concussed. I told him I hadn't, that it was just my hand. And that's when he asked how long I'd owned the place. When I said I'd just bought it, his face changed. Apparently, the previous brewer, the man whose recipe she had followed, had died in that same brewery under eerily similar circumstances. Name was Hal, Maria said softly. They said he fell from the bright tank during a late-night brew and hit the floor. Lived long enough to make it to the hospital, but never really recovered. The head injury changed him, made him mean, angry. His friends said he wasn't the same man after that. The brewery went under not long after. She fell quiet for a moment before adding, from what they told me, Hal was brewing that same honey beer when it happened. We sat in silence for a time. Alfred nosed at her hand until she laughed. The tension breaking like a glass finally set down. After that night, she said, I called that recipe Memento Mori. Fitting name for something that reminded me how close I'd come. But here's the funny part. After I renamed it and finished it, the weird happenings stopped. No more flickering lights, no more voices. It was like Hal stayed behind to make sure it turned out right. I looked down at the beer in my glass. Somehow, it tasted different now, heavier. That's quite a story, I said finally. Maria smiled, but her eyes carried that thoughtful gleam again. I like to think Hal got some peace out of it. The way I see it, he just wanted his last beer done right. She reached under the counter and handed me a chilled 4-pack, wrapped carefully in brown paper. On the house, she said. First one's free. If you ever want more, you'll have to come back. I packed up my things, Alfred, still crunching on the chew bone she'd given him. Thanks for the story, I said before stepping through the swinging doors. Maria's voice followed me out, warm and low. Take care, Alan, and remember, she said. Everything we make eventually brews into memory. That night, unpacking at home, I noticed something tucked under the 4-pack she'd given me. A sticky note in looping script. Y'all come back now. Beside her name, Maria was a small, drawn heart. I don't know if recipes can really be haunted, but every time I drink that beer, smooth, golden, with honey on the tongue, and something I can't quite name, lingering at the end, I feel like Hal's ghost is sitting somewhere nearby, finally content. For as long as I can remember, my life has been woven with moments I couldn't explain. Things from the corner of my eye, voices when no one was home, objects that moved or disappeared only to reappear in strange places. My whole family has had brushes with the paranormal in one way or another. Except my oldest sister, she seems immune. But me and my other sister, we seem to attract it. Like magnets for whatever walks between this world and the next. I grew up understanding that things unseen can still be felt. My mother's side of the family has always believed in energies, spells, and even witchcraft. It's not uncommon where they come from. My grandparents lived on a ranch in Mexico, a place where old traditions are passed down quietly, and where stories about spirits, demons, and curses are part of everyday conversation. They used to say the land holds memories, and sometimes those memories notice you back. It all sounded like folklore when I was younger, but the older I got, the harder it became to dismiss the things that happened to me as coincidence or imagination. Especially the night last year that still chills me to this day. It was late October, close to Halloween, and I remember because the air had that heavy, quiet cold that settles only when the seasons are about to change. I'd gone to bed earlier than usual that night, exhausted after helping my parents clean the house. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of silence that only the middle of the night can bring when even the dogs stop barking, and you swear the whole world is holding its breath. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, a slow, steady rhythm that pulled me from sleep like a hand tugging me toward consciousness. I tried brushing it off. Maybe it was just part of a dream. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I opened my eyes, staring into the dark. My room looked the same as always, but that sound was real. I reached for the time on my phone, 3:05 a.m. No lights were on in the hallway. No one else seemed awake. I sat up slowly, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. At first I thought maybe someone was at the front door, but after listening for a few seconds, I realized something that made my stomach turn. The sound wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the living room window. A chill rolled down my spine. I waited for a moment, half expecting my parents or the renters who lived in the attached part of our house to stir. But nothing. The house stayed still. I strained my ears. It was unmistakable now. Someone was knocking on the glass. The knocks weren't frantic or rushed. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted to make sure I heard. By now, my heart was hammering in my chest. I sat perfectly still in bed, listening as the knocking continued. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was someone playing a prank? Maybe a drunk neighbor got lost? But that made no sense. Our house sat at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by dense, dark fields. The more I thought about it, the worse the fear got. What made it worse was how loud it was. I knew for sure other people must have been able to hear it too. My parents' room wasn't that far away, and the renters had the bedroom closest to the living room, yet no one stirred. Not even our dog. That's what unsettled me most. Our Chihuahua, Chico, is usually a bundle of nerves who barks at everything. Footsteps outside, creaking floors, even the refrigerator kicking on. But now, he was sound asleep at the foot of my bed, completely oblivious. Not even a twitch of his ear. I covered my mouth with my hand to quiet my breathing and kept listening. Knock, knock. Then, silence. For a second, I almost let myself think it was over. But then came something new. A sound that didn't make sense. It was a low, guttural grunt, muffled but close. It sounded like a man, an irritated voice, deep with frustration, as if whoever was at that window was angry I hadn't answered. The next sound hit like a sledgehammer. Bang! I jumped as the window rattled under the impact. Something had slammed against the glass, hard enough to make the whole wall tremble. Another bang followed, then another, each one louder than the last. It sounded like someone pounding their fists in fury, shaking the window as though trying to break it open. I couldn't move. Fear rooted me to the mattress. I wanted to scream for my parents, but my throat refused to make a sound. All I could do was sit there, gripping the sheets tight in my fists as the banging came again, each shake of the glass stabbing through my heart like a second heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. No more knocking, no more grunting, just silence again. I sat there for a long time, waiting. The seconds dragged by, my mind spinning with every possible explanation. Maybe a drunk stranger, maybe a prank, maybe some nightmare I hadn't fully woken up from. At some point, exhaustion got the best of me. My mind drifted in and out until I finally fell asleep, the fear still coiled tight in my chest. But peace didn't last long. When I opened my eyes again, my heart almost stopped. That same soft knocking was back. This time, it sounded quieter, more hesitant, like fingertips tapping instead of fists pounding. But it was definitely coming from the same window. I grabbed my phone from under the pillow and squinted at the screen. 5 a.m. For a moment, all I could do was stare into the dark hallway leading to the living room. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe. Then, as quickly as it had started, the knocking stopped again, like whoever, or whatever it was, had realized I was awake and listening. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. I must have drifted off again, because the next thing I remember was hearing my dad getting up for work around 6:30. Relief washed through me. As soon as I heard water running in the kitchen, I hurried out of bed and went straight to him. "Dad," I whispered, trying not to wake my mom. "Were you up around 3? Did you hear knocking last night?" He frowned, blinking at me. "No," he said. "Probably neighbors or something." He waved it off, already pulling on his work boots. I followed him to the door as he left, and when he stepped outside, I did too, just for a moment. The cool morning air felt sharp against my face. I walked to the living room window and pressed my hand against the glass, half expecting to see fingerprints, smudges, something that might prove someone or something had been there. But the glass was spotless, dew forming across its surface undisturbed. I waited until my mom was awake to tell her what had happened. She listened, but her reaction was what I'd expected. She smiled gently, trying to reassure me that it must have been a dream. "You probably imagined it, Mija," she said. "You were half asleep. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt." Later that day, she asked our renters if they'd heard any strange noises in the night. They said no, which confused me even more. Their bedroom wall sits right across from that same window. How could they not have heard the banging? For days afterward, I couldn't shake it. I'd fall asleep with my heart beating fast, always listening for that sound to return, but it never did. Maybe it was some lost drunk knocking on the wrong window. Maybe someone trying to scare us, or worse. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling it wasn't human. There's something about 3 in the morning that makes me uneasy now. It's the time when everything goes still, when something beyond us seems to take notice. I still think about that night sometimes, about how nobody else woke up, about how my dog didn't make a sound, about why the knocking came back just before sunrise. Was it a person outside, angry because no one answered? Or was it something else entirely, something that wasn't knocking to come in, but knocking to get my attention? I don't know what it was. All I know is that whatever stood outside that window at 3 a.m. wasn't meant to be seen, and I'm glad I never looked. There are 2 stories connected to this, one that isn't mine but came from someone I met, and one that is very personal to me. They both sit in that space where real-world horror and something possibly paranormal overlap, and they both stayed with me in different ways. The first story is not my direct experience, but it came from a girl my neighbor knew. It has been a long time, so I don't remember exactly how they were related, maybe a family friend, maybe a cousin, but I do know I actually met the girl myself. She was real, not just some friend of a friend rumor, and the way she carried herself, quiet and heavy, made it clear that what she had lived through was real too. According to what I was told, her life changed in the worst way possible because of something her stepfather did. He killed her mother. It wasn't an accident or a mystery. It was something violent and deliberate. After he killed her, he wrapped her body in a blanket. That part alone is chilling because it suggests a strange mix of guilt, shame, and the need to hide what he had done. Then he did something even more disturbing. He put her mother's body in the back of his car. Not in the trunk, not somewhere far away, but in the back, wrapped up and hidden. And then he took the girl with him. He drove her down to her relative's place with her dead mother in the car the entire time. Imagine that, sitting in a car with the man who just killed your mother, knowing or maybe not even fully knowing what had happened yet, while her body is in the back under a blanket. Whether the girl realized it in that moment or only later, the truth casts a long, terrible shadow backward onto that car ride. To this day, the idea of that drive quiet road, closed windows, the weight of something awful hidden behind you, feels like something from a horror movie. Except this wasn't fiction. It was someone's life. That story doesn't have a classic ghost in it, no shaking chains or shadow figures. But there is something haunting about it in a different way. Sometimes the most terrifying things don't come from the supernatural at all, but from what people are capable of doing to each other. Real-world horror like that leaves a scar, and in a way, it becomes its own kind of ghost that follows everyone touched by it. The second story is mine. It's smaller and quieter, but it meant a lot to me when it happened. My mom died of cancer several years ago. It was not sudden. It was the kind of sickness that creeps in slowly, stays too long, and drains everything out of a house: energy, hope, and eventually life. When she was alive, I was working overnight shifts at Target. My schedule meant I would come home very late, often in the early hours of the morning when everything was dark and quiet. My mom had a small habit that became very comforting to me. She used to leave the hallway light on for me. It was her way of saying, without words, "I'm waiting for you," or "You're not coming home to an empty, dark place." I would come in, tired from work, see the warm glow in the hall, and know she had thought of me before going to bed. It was a simple thing, but it mattered. After she passed away, the world felt different. The routines I was used to had holes in them. The house was quieter in a way that felt wrong. I kept working my overnight shifts because life doesn't stop, even when you feel like it should. One day, after one of those shifts, I came home and noticed the hallway light was on. For a moment, my brain reacted the way it always had. Mom left the light on. Then reality caught up, and I reminded myself that she was gone. I brushed it off, though. I told myself I must have forgotten to turn it off before leaving. Grief can make you foggy. Maybe I'd been distracted and left it on without thinking. Then it happened again. After my next overnight shift, I came home and found the hallway light on once more. Same warm glow, same familiar feeling. Again, I tried to be logical. I must have done it again, I thought. Maybe I had gotten into the habit of leaving it on and just wasn't paying attention. But as it kept happening, something started to feel different. The next time I was getting ready to leave for work, I decided to be extra careful. Before I walked out the door, I checked the hallway light and made sure it was turned off. I consciously noticed it. Dark hallway, light switch off. I even took a moment to remember it, so I couldn't later blame it on forgetfulness. Then I left for my shift. When I came home again, the hallway light was on. The same light my mom used to leave for me. The same glow welcoming me back from a long, lonely night. Only this time, I knew for a fact that I hadn't turned it on. I had made sure of it before I left. The feeling that washed over me wasn't just fear. It was a mix of sadness, comfort, and unease. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a wiring issue or a faulty switch. Electrical problems happen in homes, and sometimes lights flick on and off on their own because of loose connections or old fixtures. But another part of me couldn't ignore the timing, the habit, the link to my mom. Before my next shift, I stood in the hallway and looked at the light. The apartment was empty. No one else was there. I felt a little foolish, but I spoke out loud anyway. I said something like, "I'd rather the light wasn't left on for me. It's freaking me out." It was a strange thing to say into an empty space, but I said it honestly. I didn't yell or demand. It felt more like talking to my mom, telling her how I felt the way I used to when she was alive. I left the hallway light off, checked it again, and then went to work. When I came home that time, the hallway was dark. The light was not on. It stayed that way. After that, the light stopped turning on by itself. Whether it was my imagination, a coincidence, a faulty switch that just happened to settle, or my mom finding one last small way to show she was there and then respecting my wish, I can't say for sure. What I do know is how it felt. It felt like an old habit trying to continue even after the person was gone, a final echo of a mother's small, quiet care for her child coming home late at night. And when I asked it to stop because it scared me, it did. Between the neighbor's tragic story of a stepfather driving with a body hidden in the back seat and my own experience with a hallway light that seemed to remember my mom's love, I've learned that haunting doesn't always look the same. Sometimes it's a nightmare made real by human hands. Sometimes it's a soft glow in the dark that makes you wonder if love really ever leaves, or if it just changes shape and waits for you at the end of a long shift, one last time. Thanks for spending your night with True Nightmares. If these stories helped you relax, hit like and subscribe, and pick the next episode on your screen so the creepy stories can keep playing while you fall asleep.